Okay, we are live. Just give me a moment, everyone, while I get on to YouTube. Thanks for joining us tonight. I hope nobody had any trouble with the subway getting here. Thanks for joining us tonight. All right, we're good to go. All right. Good evening. Welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. Tonight, we are very pleased to be presenting Mernet Larsen recent work. I would like to thank all of you for joining us from wherever you are, and I would like to especially thank Mernet for joining us. And this is a talk that was originally scheduled for last March, I believe, and was postponed because of everything. So I'm really glad that we are seeing it through and it's happening tonight. It's the second talk in our spring evening lecture series, so it's been highly anticipated for a while. Before we begin, I would like to just recognize that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors. Please do consider making a donation either during or after tonight's talk by clicking on the support button of our homepage at www.nyss.org and click donate. We're very grateful for any donation, and the lecture series would not be possible without your contributions. So thank you. I would also like to point out at the bottom of your screen the chat button, the Q&A button, and then the raise your hand button. Feel free to enter chats or questions throughout the talk. Mernet might address some while the slides are up, and then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. And if you raise your hand, I'll try to put you on the screen so you can ask Mernet sort of face to face. Okay. Mernet Larsen has exhibited extensively since the late 1970s and has been the subject of over 30 solo exhibitions, including Mernet Larsen, The Ordinary Reoriented at the Akron Art Museum in 2019, and Getting Measured Mernet Larsen 1957 to 2017, Tampa Museum of Art in 2017. She has been featured in more than 70 group exhibitions, including presentations at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., and the American Academy of Arts and Letters in New York, amongst many others. Her work is in numerous collections, including the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in Los Angeles, California, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, among others. Mernet received her BFA from the University of Florida, her MFA from Indiana University, and in normal times, she splits her time between Tampa, Florida, and Jackson Heights here in New York. She's Professor Emeritus at the University of South Florida, and she is represented by James Cohen Gallery, where she just recently had a show that closed, I believe, on January 23rd here in New York. And I just found out that James Cohen Gallery is producing a new monograph of Mernet's work, which is going to be out in March. So look forward to that. Without further ado, please join me in a virtual welcome for Mernet Larsen.
Hello, everybody. It's very weird here. I feel like I'm talking to myself. I'm looking at myself. The last time I spoke at the studio school was in 2002. Graham Nixon invited me and also included me in a group show here. 3 years later, David Cohen curated a solo show of my work at the studio school gallery. I was in my 60s then, and had never really shown my work outside Florida. where I had taught for 35 years. As you can imagine, these opportunities were really a big deal for me. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Graham and David and the studio school for the pivotal role they had in giving me visibility in New York and beyond. And when the things start to appear, yes, I guess I will soon, I just have a shot of my last show at James Cohen Gallery. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the images that I'll be showing you tonight, all about in the range of 5 feet, 5.5 feet, their longest dimensions, all acrylic on canvas and mixed media.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, as I say, here's the gallery shot of most recent work. Okay. Since I turned 80 this year, I thought I would try to look back and see some of the things that have been constant during the 60 plus years I have been making art. First would have to be my desire to give form to the actual concrete things in my life, objects, people, places, events. I had no desire to either express my feelings towards them or passively observe them. Painting would be a way of giving form and meaning to what I thought of as a fairly banal existence, to make the familiar seem unfamiliar and fresh. Second, and related, was my interest in perspective, not in the mechanical sense, but in the broader sense. What is the viewer's point of view? Where does the viewer stand? What is the viewer's relationship psychologically and spatially? And finally, third, that what you see determines how you see. That recognition is what causes you to organize visual information. It makes no sense to have a style of painting where you apply indiscriminately. You apply your style indiscriminately to everything you see, still lives, people, landscapes. By the time I was 20, I had made up my mind that I would approach every subject matter according to its dictates. So I'm going to talk about these three things one at a time and follow through on them from the beginning. The painting on the left of a car interior was done in my late 20s, about 1968. I asked, how does a car demand to be painted? Well, I experienced a car from the inside. How do I capture that location or that perspective? I ended up using the hemispherical reflective surface of a stainless steel teapot. That didn't become a style, and then I didn't run around trying to see everything in curved surfaces, but it was a unique solution to dealing with the subject matter of the car. Now, fast forward now to the mid 70s. Then I'm in my mid 30s. I was living off and on in New York during that decade. And I was in love with the city. I spent most of my day people watching in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, particularly the old cafeteria there. It was great. And in Washington Square. And I wanted to paint that process of looking, where I was never looking at a view or a spatial gestalt, but was looking at hundreds of people, some of whom I knew, some strangers. So I ended up interweaving fragments of photographs, each one shot in different lights, some in black and whites. And I started right in the center with that figure with the hand. We can go on to the next slide here, Sam. Yeah. I painted that. I had no idea what the rest of the painting would be. And then I just worked out from there, trying to see what seemed to work, what seemed to fit. until I finally more or less wove the whole thing together. I avoided any conventional perspective in here. And I also wanted to avoid having a sense of collage, so that it was really like making a color field painting built out of what I called perceptual units, where color and content were inseparable. Next slide. Okay, fast forward to the next decade. In 1980, I decided to commit to teaching and to stay in Tampa, University of South Florida. When I got there, I found I could no longer do the paintings I had been doing in New York. The photos and my method seemed to accurately convey being a detached spectator. The people and places seemed to have no weight or solidity, nor did they betray any involvement or interaction. So I started studying Renaissance painting techniques and found that 15th century Italian painters often started their paintings by drawing geometric blocks for the figures. I like my own paintings, my own versions of Renaissance paintings better at that stage. I began to work with more simplified, invented characters and impose a bit of an attitude. However, the space remained very conventional. This perspective of looking at something on a stage or out a window. And in any case, I couldn't get any traction at this point on this way of working. I then embarked on about 15 years of experimentation, working basically pretty abstractly, which I won't go into because of time. I also traveled a good bit during this decade in Japan, India. India and Japan were particularly important, but I also went to China and to countless other places. Okay, now fast forward to Y2K on the right here, about the turn of the century. I was turning 60. I was ready to retire from 35 years of teaching, and I wanted to reconnect with a clear sense of recognition, of representation, even narrative, not unrelated to the painting on the left that I'd been doing 15 years earlier. But I wanted to use what I had learned in the interim, which was namely this. What I would be making would be substitutes or analogs for the real world I experienced. They would not be derived from conventional representation, but would be structures that could be stand-ins for whole situations. I would need to convey a perspective where the viewer seemed to be both inside and outside, kind of wearing the situation, I thought. So I started using parallel perspective, where the viewer, which is really like in traditional Japanese narrative painting, but also the perspective that architects use, where parallel lines stay parallel and give a sensation of depth, but not a sensation of illusion. And also, I didn't want any of the viewers, the paintings, the characters in the paintings to face the viewer. They were not involved in being looked at. So they're always at some sort of oblique angle. And they're not organic. They're compiled out of body parts, sort of like a committee of parts that become a whole character. Okay, oh, go ahead, next slide. Here's a couple more I did. Both, the one on the left is using the parallel perspective and the same spirit that I was talking about. And in all of them, and the ones I'm doing even now, I usually had some things that were extremely, almost photographically detailed. Like spend a lot of time figuring out guns, learning about guns. In the one on the left, which was more or less like a memory of playing cowboys when I was a kid. And the soles on the feet of the figure on the left, very detailed. And it seemed like when I had these shifts to that extreme detail, they made the whole thing seem much more believable and less stylized, I guess. The one on the right, I experimented with having a one-point perspective, like the space these two people shaking hands were in was its own kind of world, its own space. And the two characters shaking hands are both done in parallel perspective. And I tried to think of the hands where they're gripping each other, shaking their hands, which are painted in great photographic detail, as being a kind of separate entity in themselves. Okay, next slide. That one was, the handshake was part of being teaching in the university. I became very interested, because I always had been interested in painting faculty meetings. That nobody ever paints faculty meetings. A lot of artists teach and go to faculty meetings. So I started like paintings like the one on the left, which, as you can see real obviously, is in parallel perspective with those concrete blocks on the wall, none of which are converging. But I found that I couldn't do more than about 3 characters without it becoming very messy and arbitrary seeming. So I tried to figure out another way of dealing with faculty meetings. Again, to go back to the subject matter determines the approach and my interest in using what kind of perspective, where the viewer is. So I had this thought, what if usually with perspective, the vanishing point is infinitely far away and all parallel lines converge at the vanishing point, as you know. So I thought, what would happen if I made myself the vanishing point down there at the bottom and had everything get larger as it went away from me? So I took these pictures of my colleagues in faculty meetings and a lot of little pictures, and I turned them upside down and I traced the tables. And then I tried to construct the characters, the real people that were there around the tables, the upside down or the reverse perspective tables. Which was really fun. I really enjoyed doing that. And what started to happen is characters that were very insignificant in the photographs became very important in the paintings. And I found that people looking at these assumed that they were about hierarchy. So this one on the right then becomes these 2 characters that were just in the background in the photograph become kind of the central character and the central event in this. Okay, next. And here's another one on the left called Committee. When I started, when these became very large, and this was about 6 or 7 feet across, there was this problem of what to do with under the tables, because if I did the legs to match people, the legs would go off the bottom of the painting and the whole thing would just flatten out. So I ended up doing these tiny little legs, which I thought were really funny. At first I thought it was stupid because they were so disconnected with the top. But the more I looked at them, the more it seemed sort of right, like it was a whole different world down there under the table anyway. And then I had a way of making these tile floors in parallel perspective while the rest of it was in reverse perspective. Okay. Now we're going to fast forward another up to near the present. The painting on the right was done about five years ago, I think. I decided to do some paintings of the cabinet meetings and situation rooms in Washington. I had worked on Obama's first campaign, even met him once. I became fascinated with the environment these decisions were made in Washington. But now there would be a lot more characters than the faculty meetings. And since they were all around a single table, you would be seeing a lot of backs. So I started experimenting with unfolding the space so that now some of the characters are actually upside down, folded away from the table. And you as a viewer, your perspective as a viewer is more omnipotent, but it's not exactly omnipotent like a top view or a map would be. But you're kind of, I think, kind of soaring around in the space. Okay, next slide. I wanted to show the photo I used for this painting, or typical of all the paintings I did with the reverse perspective. And there's something that happens here that I can't believe, and you might not be able to believe either. I took that shape in the photograph on the left, traced it, and turned it upside down. And that's what the shape is on the right. Now, the other day went and got that photograph out again and traced it again because I could not believe that was the same shape. It looks so short and squat on the right. And you impose the rectangle because we're used to seeing perspective in that conventional one-point perspective way. So again, the characters have been somewhat unfolded, and those three women who are way down at the other end, have become suddenly very important characters, and those bystanders with their hands dangling down. Obama's in there somewhere in the middle. You can see the president always sits on the side in the middle, and by the time it gets reversed, he's really down in there. Okay, next slide. And also, I was doing the Situation Room. That table was rather fascinating. It was curved on both sides and then had flat ends, and then had this gold thing inserted down the center, I guess, which was where you could plug in all your electronic stuff. So I tried one of those in just straightforward reverse perspective, but as you can see, I did have some problems then with what to do with legs and the feet, and came up with a solution which I'm not totally happy with, but is the best thing I seem to be able to come up with. If I did legs in a normal position, which I did try, and the floor and everything normally, the whole thing became very flat, very fast. Some of these characters you might be able to recognize in this, but I won't tell you who they are. On the right, I went for broke here. I decided to make the whole thing, the table, the character then, that's our Obama character at the end of this table, and all the people on his, whoever was in there meeting with him, and their little laptops. One contraption, like it was one object. In fact, it's like one object that was walking along, so that those two black characters at the bottom dangling down there become like the legs of the whole thing, walking it along. And then I ended up putting a one-point perspective system. I tried to make it the perspective on the floor like agree with the table, but it just didn't work. So I ended up making a very deep one-point perspective space so that this contraption of the characters with their meeting, having their meeting, became literally an object in the room. Okay, next. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears completely here. On the first part, I wanted to emphasize experiments with perspective over the last 60 years. But that hasn't been all that I've been thinking about. That's just been one tactic. Over the last 20 years, I've been intermittently doing what I would call Rorschachs, as in the classic text test, where a subject is asked to interpret an ink blot, needing a trained psychiatrist to get access to the subject's unconscious. So when I was in India, I saw these paintings in Udaipur, in Rajasthan, which I just loved. They're great big paintings, about 5 or 6 feet across for India. You don't think of paintings being big. I love these paintings, and I was trying to figure out some way to utilize them in my painting. So I decided to try to unsee it and to deal with it as if it was a Rorschach, and just look at the structure. And I figured that as a true Rorschach test, it would reveal to me a content that was subconsciously important to me. And it began to seem to me like two parents looking at a baby. Now this, I tried to stay as close to the structure of the painting, the Indian painting, as I could, and then change the color and add, obviously, other things. So this process allowed me to come up with things I never would have come up with if I had started with the idea of parents with a baby, which I probably would never come up with that idea anyway. But, for example, that extra bend in the back, that stair-stepping, zigzagging bends in the back, seems to me to be very important and powerful in an odd sort of way. I mean, if you imagine that painting with those just being ordinary curves leaning over, it seems like it would just ruin it. And because, as I said earlier, I thought of these as analogs, not illusions. I think, and I hope that people, when they look at these, accept that these aren't pictures of freaks, but they live in this world, believably. Okay, next. Okay, so I did several of the Udaipur paintings, and I did a lot of paintings using Japanese 12th century narrative scrolls, particularly the Kitano Shrine scroll in Kyoto, where I had spent some time in 1985. So you can see here where I used it upside down. I looked at it upside down, and it became this more surreal than usual for me. I usually like it to stay sort of within the ordinary world. But it's a mall. I meant it to be a mall, and there's characters on the mall holding a baby up. And down there, you can barely see in the lower right-hand corner is a parking lot with some cars parked in it, and this long walkway. And then this bird, which now appears to be having something to do with this baby, is an offering. And once in a while, I wander into that kind of territory. It's very untypical. But that upper left-hand corner had to have something. Okay, next. The main artist I looked at when I did Rorschachs was Lisitsky, the Russian constructivist painter from the first part of the 20th century. His paintings all worked well with the approaches to perspective I've been using, but they added an unpredictable characteristics, which I love trying to integrate. This one was done about 15 years ago. You can see it's on its side of these two men carrying packages. Who knows what's in the packages in a mall. I really wanted to do the mall. Like I wanted to do faculty meetings, because I spent a huge amount of time in the mall, not shopping, just wandering around. That's what I did for breaks. Okay, next. Okay, now we're up to the present. So I'm going to slow down a little on each painting and talk about them a little more. This one, and I decided about 2 years ago to do a whole series of paintings that were just based on Lisitsky, Rorschaching Lisitsky's compositions. So here's one. Here's the Lisitsky on the left. And when I turned it various ways, and I must add that one could see zillions of things Rorschaching an abstract painting, but I could only use this method if the scene seemed really compelling to me. As a true Rorschach, it's as if it delved things out of me that I didn't know were important. So I turned the Lisitskys upside down and sideways until something clicked. On the right is a study I always start with a 19 by 24 inch painting on paper. So there's a man in a wheelchair on a sidewalk in a precarious position. There seems to be a road in the distance, as if it's off a cliff and it's in a different space, with a red truck. And maybe there's someone on the sidewalk on the other side of the road. Okay, next slide. So then after I do the studies, I enlarge them onto the painting. And then I work on them for at least a couple months, hundreds of hours usually. From the get-go, I saw this man in a wheelchair as having a good time, mischievously leaning back at a precarious angle. In fact, I think the color also reinforces an upbeat reading. Nonetheless, it's undeniable that the intersection is dangerous, even an allegory of danger. An eagle hovers in the empty space between the sidewalk and the fields beyond. There's a shift between our view of the man we're looking up at, so we're monumentalizing him, and the sidewalk, which we are seeing from above as a map. So getting the wheels to believably live in that space and in that contradiction was probably, I spent 50 hours working on just the wheels. I was hoping when I started the study that I could just have one circle and you would believe the other one was behind it, but it looked like a steering wheel or something. So I researched all kinds of wheelchair wheels. And the other thing that became very important to me was that joint where the Y shape of the sidewalk meets the brown highway. I really wanted that to click into place there. And with almost everything I was doing with the wheels, it was somehow blocking that joint off. So it looks like nothing now, no big deal, but it took forever to figure that out. And to make that turquoise circle where the center of the wheel is, so that there was an actual shift there spatially to free you from what was happening spatially behind it. And that Aqua repeated again on the front panel there. And I was convinced when I started that study that the background could be just parallel perspective, a dark green parallel perspective, and it would just work, but it did not. So again, that's where I spent most of the rest of my time, was figuring out what to do there. And I started thinking about Van Gogh's wheat fields and James Mcgarrell's paintings had these big sweeping panoramic landscapes. So I ended up working from an upside down photograph of some fields, which then, of course, became in reverse perspective. I had to have reverse perspective for there to be an actual shift there, and for the red truck, which seemed somehow related to whatever narrative was going on here. I don't know what, but it seemed important. So that if I did it in some sort of normal perspective, it would be totally invisible. I ended up painting out that once. And then when I work on these, I usually, just an aside on process here, once I lay in the initial colors from the study, I start using tracing paper. I lay tracing paper on top of areas that I'm working on and trace the hands or the wheel or whatever area it is. And then I take it over to a table and try different versions of it, paint different versions of it. And then these painted details, I get wet and lay onto the painting and try things until I get things that work. And when they work, I glue them on. That is, I use acrylic medium to attach them. So by the time the painting is finished, there's very little of the painting that's just straight acrylic paint. Almost all of it is acrylic paint on tracing paper, which I like much better as a surface than acrylic, which I really don't like very much. And then there's these formal problems that come up like near the end. what the lower left-hand corner was really boring, so I put these shears in because it seemed to echo the why. I really liked that, and it was logical. I could have done other things, but that seemed logical. And then, but other people seem to see that as some sort of danger, some sort of signal of danger, and along with the bird, which was probably the last thing I did, something ominous about this otherwise rather nice scene. And where originally I had started out with some characters on the right-hand side, man or something standing there on the side of a slope. I didn't want a slope, I wanted it to jarringly jump back, so it was really in the distance. So I had to put something on the sidewalk, which eventually evolved apart at the time, apart as a time. In other words, I had a body first because I needed that horizontal line. And then eventually I had a very photographic looking head here that became the most photographically painted thing. So everything in it became repainted. The only thing that stayed the same was the character of the figure, which was exactly the same as it was in the study. Never touched it really again. Okay, next. Here's a detail showing, and you can get a little, people when they see these reproduced always assume these are very graphic paintings, just, but they're actually rather physical paintings with a lot of surface detail. Okay, next. Okay, so I was looking at this Lissitzky painting on the left, and Lissitzky does a lot of circles. So what can circles be? Well, they can be tabletops, and they can be, as they were in the last one, a wheel. But then I thought, of course, it could also be a sphere. And then I thought about spheres, and I thought about Earth. And the idea of doing Earth seemed really intriguing to me. So I started Googling photographs of the Earth. And also, I really like the idea that this became a way or an excuse to have a sunset the way we experienced it on Earth, there on the upper right, setting over some water, as a straight line. The horizon's a straight line, and the sun is disappearing behind it. So there you're looking at how we normally see a sunset, even though we know that it's not like that. The sun is somewhere else far away, and we're turning. So that was sort of a playful thing to do. I also thought I would try to do reverse perspective, but you can't. Outer space is disorienting anyway, and the kind of vertigo that I was getting in some of the other paintings didn't mean much in this painting because in outer space there's no gravity, so there's no frame of reference. I tried anyway to make one astronaut, this big astronaut, and then a small astronaut, as if it was in reverse perspective. But it seems nobody sees it as reverse perspective. Most people see it as a baby astronaut or as some sort of mummy or something else, which is okay. I mean, next slide. And it really, I decided I wanted to do two of these, a pair from the same Lissitzky, one with the astronaut from the front, the other from behind, and one where the Earth is a body of primarily the wet climate, the wet planet, and the other one, it's the third rock from the sun, meaning Earth. And on the right, since I didn't have this event of the other astronaut, I decided to focus more on the hands and what the astronaut was doing. And as I researched that, I found that the main tool that astronauts have when they go out in outer space leave their spaceship is wrenches, because there's on the space station or whatever, there are all these bolts that have to be tightened all the time. So I tried to have two different tools, but actually I could only come up with wrenches. So I thought they were kind of seemed like castanets almost, like this astronaut was out there with his two wrenches. Maybe was going to hand one to another astronaut off screen here. Okay, next. Here's some details. On that one, you probably couldn't see it in that other slide, but on the horizon of the Earth is a sort of old-fashioned train, choo-choo train, trudging along there, going around, circumnavigating the globe. Okay, next. And here was one of called a gurney, a character, a woman sitting on the edge of a gurney with a guy who's, I thought was sick, but maybe other people thought he was already dead. But that's where people started to point out to me that my paintings started to seem more like some big social issues, where they had been more private before. And I actually did this painting right before the pandemic. I was finished before the pandemic, finished right before the pandemic. Next, we'll go on to the next one here. Then in a couple others I did, this one on the left turned into these characters that seemed to be leaving. I love the way they were kind of leaning forward, and everything was moving off to the left, pushing this vehicle. And even this penguin joined them, although this seemed more like Arctic rather than Antarctica, and I don't think there are any penguins in the Arctic. I liked the way that the post office, this post office, seemed to be being carried by these characters as a small miniature post office. On the other hand, it could also be read as a post office in the distance. Well, that's a bit of a stretch since I have these parallel perspective lines. And then I ended up with an American flag on the top there. I wanted to just be a neutral flag, but nothing else seemed to work. So this, people have pointed out to me, seems to be about global warming, which was not something that occurred to me when I started it. But the one on the right, which is this guy with the gun, seemed, even I noticed when I started that, of course, this seemed like someone, white supremacist or something, or somebody with a gun, a hunter, but it could just be a hunter, maybe standing on some sort of cliff looking out over a beach. And on this beach are two characters, which appear to be maybe African-American, maybe not, who may be victims, but they may be just lying there in the sun. And then there's some people running off to the right, or maybe they're just walking off to the right and walking down the beach. So, but this one clearly is very timely, I guess. You know, these waves are these great big giant object-like waves coming into. Okay, next. This one started out on the left where I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I could have this one figure upside down and the other one right side up, and then I'd have the building, the right side would be one way and the left side would be the other way. As if you had to turn the painting upside down to see them both. And that big white thing in the middle would be sort of plaza, or you're looking down on a plaza. And I somehow thought that would work. But one day my studio assistant came in and he said, that's a big communion wafer. And I thought, oh no, it's never going to work. It's never going to be seen just looking down on. It's always going to be seen looking across. So I completely shifted gears and moved the horizon to the bottom and then reluctantly decided that this had to be an angel if it was upside down, although angels are practically never upside down. And I understand when they are, it's a bad sign. It means they're bad angels. And in the Lisitsky was this strange sienna shape. Well, it wasn't sienna, but I made it sienna shape in the middle. But what interested me and started me on it was this delivery, the idea that a delivery was taking place. And I thought, well, is it delivering a big cheese? Is it a big piece of bread? Or is it just a package? It was like, this is painting really about something being delivered from Amazon or something, which is something that has become my life now. But it was when I started to work with how they were going to really hold on to that I thought it needed handles. And then I ended up turning it into this chicken. And as it seemed to be some sort of a ritual with the chicken, perhaps this became a moon in the background, but I didn't want it to be like a ritual, and I didn't want it to be romantic. So I tried to make it very artificial and close, with all the little craters showing, and the actual delineation of the sphere. Okay, so I don't know what these paintings mean ever, actually. I don't work from an agenda or from meaning ever. The meaning is something that I see or feel is right. And sometimes later, they start to become very significant. This starts to seem, well, it really might have to do with the fact that I love animals and eat chickens, and the kind of contradiction that's involved there. Okay, next. Okay, and this is the last painting that I did this year or last year. And it's the first one of the Rorschach ones based on any other paintings. It's of a table, people around the table. The subject matter I've done most over the years has been people around tables, and that's what's the thing I do most in my life. But I found an Lisitsky that lent itself to people being around the table. So this is what happened when I did it. I made quite a few changes, but one of the things in the Lisitsky was that the circles became almost a spiral-like. And as you can see on the seat that they're sitting on, it's much smaller on one end than the other. So that sort of sets it into motion, and spirals, so that they're sort of spiraling like this model of the solar system would be in reality spiraling. So they're getting a lecture on the solar system as they sit around this booth. But working from the Lisitsky allowed me to do things I say I would never think of doing if I was just starting like I did with the one on the right, with a photograph of the cabinet. For example, I got to make this guy put his foot up on the booth, which is something I think a lot of people always want to do and sometimes actually do. And also that head up in the upper left, the way it was wedged into the corner and disconnected from the body, I really liked and would never have come up with in approaching it like it did on the right. The guy on the bottom, and we can go to the next slide. Okay, another contrast, another booth. This is a booth painting that was done about 15 years ago, probably. People sitting around the table at booth, some based partly on photographs, maybe mostly from my imagination or memory. And you can see how vastly different Well, they are. I had never seen them juxtaposed until I prepared this lecture, and I was kind of shocked by how completely different they are. And again, your perspective or your relationship with the source is is very is very different. Where on the left, you're much more kind of omnipotent and wandering around in the space, while in the one on the right, you're very small and looking at this sort of growing before your eyes in front of you. You're sort of enveloped. You're sort of enveloped by it. In the one on the left, the waiter is there upside down, but his wine glasses he's carrying are right side up. I figured, well, if they and you are having to listen to this lecture on the solar system, you needed some refreshment while you're sitting there. So the wine glasses are sort of an offering to both the viewer and to the people sitting at the table of a glass of wine. And the glasses of wine are right side up, and the waiter's upside down. I often like to get food in if I can. I like to read novels that have food in them too. And since we're getting to the end of this now, the painting on the right has some French fries on the table, so you can have that too. As people sometimes, I certainly have borrowed French fries from someone else's plate and laid them on the table in front of me. Okay, so now we're up to date, and I'm open to questions. And I have some extra slides, sort of appendix that might relate to other questions, or we can look at some more slides if you want to. Your wish is my command.
I'll clap for the audience, Mernet. That was wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so if you have questions, you can put them into the Q&A, which I believe is at the bottom of your screen, or you could raise your hand and ask Mernet. I'll turn on the video. I'll try to. Mernet, do you want to go back to any slide particular, or should I stop?
No. Well, why don't you go to the next one, and then we'll have another one to look at while we're talking. Okay. And if anyone wants to refer to one, then we can go back then.
Into the appendix images?
Yeah, you could go into the appendix.
Okay. Okay.
There's a couple more. Okay.
Now
I'll point one thing out here on this baseball bunt, this is called. There's a couple things I really enjoy doing, and like in this one, I really liked that he doesn't have any arms, and no one ever notices that, or if they do, they don't tell me. Yeah. But it's sufficient. It's amazing how little information we need to read figures, and also and this is true on a lot of the others too. The facial features don't match the face exactly. They sort of slide around on the face. They slide over. They disagree with the way the face is painting. And I like it when those kinds of things happen. I'd like it to happen maybe more than it does.
Is on the left, is that a reference to Utello on
the one on the left is a Lisitsky. Oh, you mean the checkerboard?
Yeah.
That's funny you would mention that. Yes, as a matter of fact, yes. Yes, there's a painting called The Flood by Uccello. And one of the characters is in a checkerboard inner tube, what appears to be an inner tube. It couldn't have been, but it appears to be. Yeah, how interesting that you would notice that. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question from Robin Miller. She asks, is there any reason the hunter from that previous painting is shaped like a 4?
Is there any reason what?
The hunter is shaped like a 4. Maybe I'll just go back to that painting really quick. In this painting on the right, I believe.
Oh, it's shaped like a what?
The number 4.
Oh, no, no one ever pointed that out. I certainly never noticed that. One thing I did in that is in the Lisitsky, um, there's that gap between what is now the arm and the body. Uh, there's sort of passageway through there. I could have filled it in and had it be just like a stick figure, um, but it seemed important to break that so that one part of the guy is just his arm and his head, and that's not connected to the other arm and the body. But no, hi, Robin.
Uh, Gail is asking, she says, this has been wonderfully interesting, but one thing you barely addressed is how or why you came to make the figures in the Blocky style. Can you talk about that a little?
Yes, well, there's several reasons. One reason they're not always that. I don't think of them as being blocky because they're very elongated usually, but they're very simplified. They're very minimal. I almost sometimes think of them as being like empty containers that anybody could get in and be that character. But as I said earlier, I've been thinking these as analogs to the world, not illusions, not even simplified illusions. So they have to function in a narrative structure that has its own rules and its own life. If I started to make those figures more naturalistic, it would just totally, the whole game would be off. They would just totally fall apart. They wouldn't be interesting at all. Now, having said that, I'm sort of I don't have any big commitment to geometry for the sake of geometry, or if they're boxes so that you see their volumes. I want them to be clearly to be volumes and not just, shapes. And the other reason was, as I mentioned, that back 30 or 40 years ago, I was doing these studies from Renaissance paintings, or of Renaissance techniques and how they made the paintings. And they started like this, okay? And then they added all these things, which I also tried doing paintings exactly like superficially like Vermeer, say. But I actually found them more interesting and opened up more possibilities when they stayed geometric solids instead of having all kinds of surface information and light. You notice I think the paintings give off light and have light, but I don't usually do shadows or thing because like the 15th century Italian painters, they're kind of timeless. I want them to be kind of timeless, monumental and timeless. And so there aren't shadows unless I absolutely need them, like I did on the one with the where all the planets are rotating around on the table. I had to have strong black shadows so that they didn't just disappear into the tabletop. There, see, there's shadows under all those planets in that model of the planet called solar system. They're connected with straws or something. You go on Google and it shows all these ways you can make your own little solar system. And then, but without those black shadows under there, they would have just disappear into that orange table.
Mernet, Jamie's going to ask some of the questions that are coming in, but I just wanted to ask really quick. You said that you didn't know what these paintings mean ever. Was there ever a point where that way in your thinking switched, where you were trying for a meaning and then you were just?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, because the paintings are really starting with content that's important to me and interesting to me. So they're more like investigations than me having an agenda and telling you something. They're more like I'm trying to find something out, about what's interesting about them. But if they become even like that last one with the gun and everything, starts to become almost didactic for me. But I like them to stay somewhat open-ended, like things really are. I mean, I deal with life that way too. I'm always the person that is saying, on the other hand, when somebody's making a point, that drives my husband crazy sometimes. It used to drive my colleagues crazy too. We're about to make a decision, I'd say yes, but on the other hand, so I sort of keep things, I'm sort of fascinated by them. Like I'm fascinated by those guys walking, all those people walking off to the left, pushing that thing. I can relate to it. I can connect to it, but I couldn't tell you what it means.
Jamie, do you want to?
Sure.
And I want the viewer too to be. I mean, they're not infinitely open-ended in terms of meanings, but on the other hand, I mean, I really paintings sort of bother me sometimes when you say, "Oh, I know what this painting's about." It's ramming it down my throat. So I like to have them somewhat open-ended, which isn't to say I want them to be infinitely ambiguous either. I don't like it could be this or it could be that. I mean, there's a lot of things that can't be. There's a lot of things these can't be, but there's a lot of things that can be. Yes, Amy?
Yeah, so we had a question from Kimberly. She said, "Hi, Mernet. Thank you for sharing your intriguing and in-depth storytelling. My question is, how much time per week do you spend in your studio? I miss seeing you in person and I'm grateful for tonight."
Thank you. I spend about, I'd say, an average of 4 or 5 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, during the pandemic, and I've been here in Tampa in my studio. We have not been out of the house until lately. We started going for walks in the woods, but I haven't met anybody or seen anyone for a year. So my schedule has been that I get up, I read the paper, I go in and I work for, say, 3 hours, 3 or 4 hours. Then I go and read or take a nap or have lunch, whatever. And then I work for another 2 or 3 hours in the late afternoon. And then I watch the news and watch mysteries, which I've never done before in my life, but we watch all these mystery series now at night. But in my life, there've been times when I get really going and spend a lot longer than that. But it reaches a point of diminishing returns after a few hours. I mean, I start to get compulsive about something, and then it kind of messes things up. I need to take a breather and get a little distance and then come back to it. So most of these paintings, though, I spend hundreds of hours on. I only do about 5 paintings a year at the most.
Thank you. And that kind of leads into another question from Barbara and Andy Schaefer. They were asking if you work on more than one painting at a time.
Yes, now I do. I used to not. When I was teaching, I usually didn't, but now I do. I usually work on up to 3. But I usually stay with one for maybe a week or 2, and then sometimes I'll just cover it up with a sheet or something, and especially if I'm stuck, which I often am. And then I'll work on another one for a couple weeks, and then I'll come back to that. Hi, Barbara and Andy are my cousins, wonderful painters. They live in Wisconsin.
We also had another question from the last slide, Sam. Someone was asking, what does the penguin mean?
Nothing. It doesn't mean anything. It just, the Lisitsky, it felt like a penguin. And humor in all of these, I feel like is important. If I don't laugh at something or with something in a painting, usually something is wrong. And in this one, I thought it was really, having a penguin there seemed really funny to me because penguins are not usually pets, as far as I know, and wouldn't be walking along with this family. And so the idea of the penguin walking along instead of a dog or something was just, it struck me as being about right, about what that painting needed. You think? Does it bother you?
I love it. Robin Miller had made a comment about that too. Do you ever laugh at what you've done? I love your work and take it very seriously, but I have found it to be humorous. So
Yeah, yeah, I do.
We have another question from Lindell. Was the painting of the baby and the parents one of the first where you based the painting on another painting?
Let's see. Well, when I was working in the 1980s, when I was in my 40s and 50s, I was doing a lot of pretty abstract paintings, and in those, I often used Elisitsky paintings or things from Elisitsky paintings and other painters, even de Kooning. But they were mixed with others. They were mixed with other things. So yes, Lindell is my sister. This is one of the first ones. It was one of the first ones. It was probably about 2002 that I did from an Elisitsky.
And then we have another question from Rebecca Weaver. Can you mention a little bit more about the significance of perspective to you and your work? It's fascinating, your interest in making a picture with certain views as these. Sometimes I'm flying or floating through the spaces.
I'm not sure what more I can add because it seems like, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about perspective. I'm not like one of those people, like, and I, like, people sometimes will mention my work in relationship to Escher, who really knows about optical illusion and perspective and all those things.
Oh, I think she froze.
Let's just give it a second. Show some of the slides.
I enjoy the perspective, you know, in a good way. So,
Oh,
no. Okay, you're back.
You're back. Were you just saying something a little bit?
Yes, could you go to the appendix?
Oh, yes.
Okay, next one, the next one. Yeah. Like this one of a kindergarten. It took me when I looked at Lissitzky a while to realize this wasn't a circle, it was an ellipse. And then I realized I didn't even know how to do ellipses. So I had to learn how to do ellipses. And that little thing that the teacher is drawing on that yellow piece of paper is the device you use for making ellipses. And then in this painting, I have a number of ellipses then, the ellipse of the balloon, the ellipse of the top of the glass of milk, that ellipse in that drawing, and that sort of becomes a theme. But I'm sort of having to learn and wing different things about mechanical drawing and perspective as I go, and I use it in a very general way. So it's not like this in-depth exploration of perspective. It's just using very, very basic principles that almost every art student has learned to establish the viewpoint and using them perversely, and also thinking about perspective as, after all, just a convention. It's not reality itself. You know, like 1 and 2 point perspective are a preferred way that we like to see things. So I like to deal with perspective as a toy that artists play with, and to make it clear to the viewer that it is a toy, and that it is a convention, and it's a choice to see it this way. And this is what happens when you see it this way. And this is what happens when you use it this way. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I don't, oh, we do have a few more questions. We have a question from Laura. She said, Mernet, it's so interesting the way you approach intersections. A nose lines up with a horizon, etc. A foot sits on the very edge of something. This serves to flatten the space, and then you use detail or perspective to put it through space again, or turn it inside out for us. Can you talk about intersections a bit?
In that particular painting, you want to talk more about that particular painting?
They didn't specify, but you could use this painting as an example.
Should I go to one?
Is there one that you'd like to speak about?
I'm not sure what, I guess I'm not quite sure what the question is. Could you repeat it or say it a little differently?
Yeah, I think they're just asking about the way that certain parts of the painting will kind of be right up against the edge.
Okay, while other things are far away, near and far things.
Yeah, and you know,
Yeah, that's a good question. And now that I think about it, I'm trying to think how there aren't that. I didn't bring paintings where I don't do landscapes very often at all, but I have done a few, and I've done at least one in reverse perspective. There's the one with the gun, the guy with the gun, which I read and saw as, because it's so big, the guy in the front is so big, as being like he's standing on the edge of the canvas. He's right, his boots are right there on the edge, and so I thought of him as being on some sort of plane that was far above the beach. And I thought that the clue that he was so big and everything else was so small would convey that near and far shift. But I noticed that some people seem to think he's just standing on the beach and is really big, but I decided to make him really big and he's standing on the beach, which bothers me a bit because I don't think I would do that or want that. So, but yeah, but the one, and it was interesting that the one with the wheelchair, where I deliberately wanted this fracture and shift into very deep space, but then had to do reverse perspective in the deep space, or I would lose everything back there. So what is happening with that one is that the things in the foreground are in parallel perspective, and then the distance space is in 1 point perspective, but it's upside down 1 point perspective. But it's giving a sense of a lot of, sort of crazy to talk about this without painting from this, but you get what I'm saying. You know, I mean, I think that for each painting is unique on how I'm going to deal with that. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's about it on questions. Not sure if anyone else wants to ask something really quick right now, but
You want to see a few slides of people that are important, other artists that are important to me?
yeah.
I don't know how we're doing on time.
I think it's okay. If you're fine, we can go.
Okay, if you go to the appendix.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, okay. There's a lot of artists, as there are for everyone, that I have felt an affinity with. No, the one after that we want to go to. But there was a lot of other people have in common too, like I really like 15th century Italian painting, especially Sassetta and Sienese painting. I really like Bruegel. I really like the Curicle. I mean, I could go on and on, maybe more obvious ones. So I'm one of the few here that maybe people wouldn't immediately think of. And this is Martin Ramirez. He's a California, he's no longer living, but California painter that spent his life in adult life in an insane asylum or mental institution. Did these incredible paintings, this amazing show. About years ago, maybe 10 respective. He takes inside tunnels, you move through and he moves around through the space. I really, really love his paintings. Okay, next one. Next one. This is one of my favorite paintings in the world. Balthus, the mountain in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I love all of Balthus's paintings, even the ones that are controversial. I think what I like so much about him is the architecture of the paintings in relationship to the psychological content of the paintings. It's just, to me, just perfect. And I think his portraits of Derain and Miro and his daughter are, to me, two of the best portraits in the world that have ever been painted. So he's a person I really, really like. Next. And the third one is Elizabeth Murray, who would be, if she had lived, about my age, a little younger, I think. And I think a lot of us in the 70s, a lot of people my age in the 70s, were very interested in figuring out ways to, at the sort of end, dried up end of abstract, totally abstract painting, to use abstract painting as a springboard for dealing with our concrete life around us. And in this one on the far right of her, as she explained, her daughter's cup, her baby daughter's cup on the table as a shaped canvas. I thought when I saw it in, must have been in the mid 70s, was just a wonderful painting. It's very inspiring to me, as works a lot of her work. And Susan Rothenberg, Louisa Chase, there were a lot of painters then, there, my generation, that were saying, okay, abstract. What happens if you use abstract art as a springboard for representational painting instead of using traditional representational art as the springboard? Okay, and next. This is a painting by Hiram Williams, who was my main mentor as an undergraduate at the University of Florida in Gainesville. And this, if you had gone to the Museum of Modern Art in 1960, you would have seen the whole first floor of the museum filled with Hiram Williams paintings. It was extremely hot then. And he was a brilliant, brilliant teacher. And I probably would not have become an artist if I had not had him as a teacher, because he really taught me that painting could be and deal with the life of the mind. It's a technical thing. And he also gave me freedom to work from my life and the things around me, while everyone else in late 1950s, when I first started college, was really locked into abstract expressionism, total activation of the surface, They really did not want anything to do with representation. Nobody wanted anything to do with representation. College Cubism, too, it was called. We had, or Joseph Albers, everything. And I just, while I learned about all those things and could do all those things a little bit, I just wasn't that interested enough to make a life of doing that. So he really, and you can see it's real obvious now, I think, looking at this when you compare it with that first slide I showed of the inside of a car. He's trying to deal with cubism without fracturing the plane. That was his idea here. So this is a striding man. Okay, next.
Shoot.
Uh-oh.
Maybe I may have lost that slide in the glitch earlier.
Oh, okay. Well, the next one was the last one I was going to show, which was a slide of James Mcgarrell's paintings. He was my mentor in graduate school at Indiana University. Wonderful painter, he died this year, and did very complicated narrative paintings. And the kind of dialogue that I had with him in graduate school, where I was trying to forge my own way to do what I wanted to do. The kind of back and forth dialogue we had, because he was the only person I knew that was just doing narratives with all sorts of objects in it. And we would just talk about, well, have you ever done volcanoes? Well, have you ever done bathtubs? Well, have you ever done, and we would go back and forth like that, because the figurative painters by then, there were a lot of them, but they were mostly like Diebenkorn and West Coast figurative painters, and then those first figurative the New York figurative painters, like Paul George's, and Leland Bell. But they were really just dealing with the figure. As a figure, they weren't dealing with really narrative. Oh, I guess Paul George's was a little, but anyway. Okay, so that's that.
I'll just go back. Jamie, did any more questions come in?
Yeah, well, Elizabeth Indianos had made a comment about the baseball player's hand and the manner in which you paint it, just enough to convey hands, made them think of Hiram Williams and the purple patch, meaning something that will carry in a painting.
Yeah. There's who was a student of mine and is a good friend now, was also a student of Hiram Williams. And Hiram Williams used to talk a lot about the painting needing a purple patch if you were painting figures or whatever in a painting. And sometimes he would just cut out a photograph, a little tiny eye, and he would paste it into one of his paintings. And I think that really has stayed with me, as I mentioned earlier, of wanting to always have something that seemed to come into sharp focus. Like in this one, the hands aren't so realistic. They're pretty much very geometric. But the baseball glove, however, the catcher's mitt, is very, if you saw the painting, it's very photographic.
Great. Well, maybe this is a good place to stop. Thank you, Mernet. If you really appreciate your generosity. This has been, I think, unique is the word. I love your work, and I think a lot of our students are happy to be seeing it and learning from you. Is there anything else that you would like to touch on?
No, thank you so much for asking me. I enjoyed having this opportunity to talk about these things and share this stuff.
Great, yeah, and I hope that hopefully we can get back together soon and to see you in New York as the next time.
Yeah, I'm getting my COVID shots Friday, my first one.
Good.
So it actually seems possible that this spring I'll be able to come to New York. I can't wait.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and everyone out there, thank you for joining us and taking this time to be on Zoom with us. We really appreciate it. So.
Bye.
Bye.